Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Awakening Church in our continuing survey of church history. Of course, by this time we've gone past the ancient church, even the medieval church. We now have introduced the Reformed Church, and we're dealing with this period of transformation into the Reformed Church. In doing so, we want to look at the contrast between the Renaissance and the Reformation. These two eras actually overlap. The Renaissance, though, was man-centered, while the Reformation saw itself as God-centered. The Renaissance was all about the dignity of man. The Renaissance was all about the glory of God. The Renaissance is characterized by Erasmus, who saw himself as a humanist, and writes a book called The Freedom of the Will. And by contrast, Luther writes a book. It's actually a rebuttal to Erasmus's work, and it's entitled The Bondage of the Will, in which he says, no, man doesn't really have freedom. His will is bound by sin. And he needs a Savior to unbind him. It has been said, in fact, it was said back then, that Luther hatched the egg that Erasmus laid. Now, Erasmus denied this charge. Erasmus said, no, Luther hatched a different sort of egg. But there's still a point to be made that Erasmus had come along and said, there's some issues with the Roman Church, and here's some different ways of looking at things. And Luther, of course, goes in a different direction. In his opinion, Erasmus is too willing to accept the Roman theology, and Luther says, no, you actually need to go back to the Scriptures. Now, one of the philosophers of the next century, Blaise Pascal, is a French philosopher, a mathematician, and he struggles with faith in God. And yet he has a near-death experience, a crisis of faith, and as a result of that, he turns to the Lord. Now, he continues to be skeptical of the church, and he says there's God and then there's the church, and they're not quite the same thing. And so he writes a series of what he called the sots, the way you say that in French is panzés, and the original title is The Defense of the Christian Religion. And so he's actually writing this to defend Christianity, not necessarily the church, of which he is skeptical, and it is a philosophical treatise that pushes the unbeliever to his logical conclusions, and therefore shows him his need for Christ, his need for God. It's not completed at his death, so it's an incomplete work, and yet it has a wonderful impact upon the world. He says, men despise religion. They hate it and fear it is true. To remedy this, we must begin by showing that religion is not contrary to reason. Goes on to say that it is venerable to inspire respect for it, and then we must make it lovable to make good men hope it is true, and finally we must prove that it is true. Elsewhere he says that Christianity is strange. It bids man recognize that he is vile, even abominable, and bids him desire to be like God. Without such a counterpoise, this dignity would make him horribly vain, or this humiliation would make him terribly abject. Some other thinkers during the period, and notice that they go from those who were Christians like Newton, to those who were skeptics like Franklin, to those who were outright atheists and against the very idea of God like Rousseau and Voltaire. And so we have an overlapping here. You have the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually what has come to be called the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. Now, it's in this context that we have two groups of Christians. One are the followers of Jacobus Arminius. They're known as the Arminians, versus those who are following the teachings of John Calvin, who we discussed in our last lecture. and so we're going to call them as Calvinists. The Arminians would say that God determined to save whoever would believe in Jesus. And the Calvinists say, well, more specifically, God determined to save certain people and bring them to faith in Jesus. The Arminians would say that Christ died for each and every man, and the Calvinists correspondingly would say that Christ's death brought some men to salvation. Christ's death actually accomplished the salvation of some men. The Arminians would say that men are saved by using their own free will. You see how this dovetails into our earlier discussion of free will. Men are saved by using their own free will to accept God's grace. The Calvinists would say men are saved as God draws them to his grace, citing what Luther had said regarding to the bondage of the will, that man's will is bound and needs a work of God to release it. Arminianism teaches that God's grace is resistible. Calvinism teaches that God's grace is irresistible, that when God moves in the life of a person to bring him to repentance and faith, then that person comes. And they would cite the words of Jesus, who said, all that the Father gives me will come to me. The Arminians teach that people retain their salvation only as they persevere in faith. Calvinists would say that the Lord the Lord will call all of those whom he has chosen to persevere. So they're both teaching a sense of perseverance. Calvinists are saying it's all up to you. The Arminians saying it's all up to you. The Calvinist is saying it's really up to God. He's the one who causes you to persevere. He gets the glory in the end. Now, one Calvinist group is the Puritans, who seek to purify the Church of England. The term Puritan was probably used by their detractors. It wasn't a pleasant term. They weren't calling themselves Puritans, although eventually they did sort of accept the term. And they felt the Church of England had not gone far enough in departing from Roman Catholicism. So they are characterized by Reformed and Calvinistic doctrine. They see God is sovereign, God is in charge, and God is the one who has brought us to salvation. They have an emphasis on education and an emphasis on studying the Scriptures that's in contrast to the Roman Catholic position that says, people shouldn't be studying the Scriptures. Leave that to the scholars and the priests, and people, you just listen to the scholar and the priest, and he'll tell you what to believe. And the Puritans say, no, that's the business of all men. Now, there is a difference between the Pilgrims versus the Puritans. The Pilgrims, who come to the Americas, they want to separate from the Church of England. The Puritans, on the other hand, they're remaining loyal to the Church of England. The Pilgrims tended to be, this is a very crass generalization, they tended to be from the poorer class. The Puritans tended to be represented in the upper middle class. The Pilgrims were antagonistic to the king because he's the one from whom they want to separate. The Puritans are loyal to the king. The Pilgrims wanted a separate church. The Puritans wanted to purify the church. The Pilgrims, they are the ones who found Plymouth Colony, and in the case of the Puritans, they found Salem and Boston colonies at just a bit of a later date. Now, one of the leaders of the church coming to Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, in a sermon in 1630, as they are making their way across the ocean to found this new colony in the Americas, he says, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." And so they are seeing themselves as God's representatives coming to this new world with the Lord's gospel. Meanwhile, in Europe, we have the rise of Pietism with Philip Spener. He's going to be the father of Pietism, actually going to introduce it. He is a German theologian and a preacher who sees the spiritual deadness in the church And he proposes that something can be done about that. Now, he's speaking about the Lutheran churches, the churches where they have been influenced by Luther and the Reformation and the right theology. He's saying, we have the right theology, but it's not touching the heart. And so he proposes small group Bible studies, he proposes an evangelism of kindness, and he proposes an importance of having a devotional life. It's not enough to know the truth, you have to use the truth in your life. Now, Spinner's going to give way, and here's our timeline. Notice we have Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and Knox at the beginning of the Reformation. We have 100 years later, we're looking at Spinner, and then his godson, Count Zinzendorf. Ludwig von Zinzendorf, he's the godson to Spener, and he offers asylum on his property to persecuted Christians. They've been persecuted in other parts of Europe, and they come and find asylum with him, and all things are going to be good, but he founds this village of Herrnhut for these refugees, and you'd think that they would all be getting along very nicely, but that's not the case. And so there's actually some problems that are taking place in Herrnhut, and initially it looks like this village just isn't going to work, and then he feels that the Lord comes, and they get in touch with the gospel, they get in touch with the ramifications of the gospel, and instead of being so concerned about themselves, they instead turn outward to missionary enterprises to seek to bring the change of the gospel to the entire world. Zinzendorf is actually going to go out, he's going to go out and he'll be taking the Gospels to the nations. He travels to the Americas, preaching not just to white Anglos, but also to blacks and to Indians, to anyone who will hear the message of the gospel. Now, on our timeline, notice this is going to be the beginning of what we call the First Great Awakening. And one of the key figures of this will be Whitefield. George Whitefield, he's friends with John and Charles Wesley, and we're going to talk about them in just a moment. He's an open-air preacher who comes on the scene in the Americas, and he is preaching not just to a handful, but he's preaching to hundreds and even to thousands. He rejects the Arminianism that will be held by John and Charles Wesley. And so we have, sort of two branches, if we can call that, of this First Great Awakening, and the larger part of it's really going to be dealing with sort of a Calvinist approach, and Whitefield characterizes that. He has these revival meetings in the Americas. It had been reputed that he was preaching to as many as 10,000 at a time. And remember, this is before they had microphones and the big amphitheaters that we have today. And Benjamin Franklin was one of his friends. In fact, Franklin used to say before he would go hear Whitefield, he'd take, he'd leave his wallet behind, take all the money out of his pockets, because he'd be tempted to give it all to Whitefield once he heard him preach. And Franklin was a little skeptical on hearing these reports that Whitefield was actually preaching to 10,000. He says, well, that's not really possible. But Franklin went to hear him preach out in the open air, and then in the middle of the sermon he started walking out, and he just sort of did the math and conducted the measurements to see how many people would have been there. And he said when he got to the point where he could barely hear him anymore, he stopped and sort of counted how many people would have been able to fit in that area. And his conclusion was, yes, it's really true that he is preaching to as many as 10,000 people at once, without benefits of microphone, because he had this big booming voice where he could project. Whitefield says it's a poor sermon that gives no offense. It neither makes the hearer displeased with himself nor with the preacher. He says we are immortal until our work is done. Of course, he viewed his ministry as being that which God had sovereignly bestowed. And so, we're here on earth as long as God calls us to be, and then when he doesn't anymore, then it's time for us to go. In speaking of him, Spurgeon later described Whitefield saying he lived. Other men seemed to be only half alive, but Whitefield was all life, fire, wing, force. And certainly he was a force with which to be reckoned. Now, if Whitefield was the preacher evangelist of the First Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards was the preacher pastor of that First Great Awakening. His maternal grandfather had been also a preacher, Solomon Stoddard, and he was an assistant pastor under his grandfather in the New England states. He became a senior pastor at his grandfather's death, and revival in his ministry began in Northampton Church and began to impact both the people in the church and people in surrounding communities. In addition to this were emotional manifestations where people began to weep and sometimes shake, and they weren't doing it because Edwards was this fiery, passionate, emotional preacher. Quite the contrary. Edwards, by all reports, he would write his sermons out and then he would read them in sort of what we might think of as almost a monotone. And yet the Spirit of God came and was making an impact in that part of the nation. Of course, it wasn't a nation yet. It was still, these were the colonies at that time. In one of his most famous sermons, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he says, "Here you are in the land of the living and in the house of God and have an opportunity to obtain salvation. What would not those poor, damned, hopeless souls give for one day's opportunity, such as you now enjoy?" Now, one of the issues here was what was called the halfway covenant, where Edwards and others before him had said, it's not enough that you were a member of the church, and this is what had happened. People had been, remember, they practiced infant baptism, so they'd become members of the church, but didn't necessarily believe the gospel, and certainly had nothing in their lives that showed they were believing the gospel. And so he said, those people aren't really, yes, they may have started as members, but they aren't communing members. We can't give them the Lord's Supper. And they don't have quite the same status as those who have come to trust in the Lord and are seeking to follow him. And this became a divisive issue in the church, and he was removed from his church over this issue. He ends up taking a church in the town of Stockbridge, which is further out in the, I guess we would call it out in the sticks, on a bit further away from civilization. And he preaches to the Housatonic Indians. He had a passion for missionary enterprises, and now he gets to use that passion. He is elected to be the president of the College of New Jersey, the college that we now call Princeton, and yet before taking the position, he contracts smallpox and he dies. Now, it's at this same time, Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, that we have the Wesley brothers. And we're especially going to focus on John Wesley. He's friends with George Whitefield, and together they are part of a sort of a holy club. In other words, a holy Bible study. They're in school together. They're studying the scriptures together, and he's impressed by the Moravians. These are the folk who had come from Zinzendorf's ministry, and by their faith and by their prayer. And somebody asked him one time, "Do you know that Jesus has saved you?" And he begins to wonder about that. He's been reading his Bible, he's been trying to follow the Lord, and he wonders, have I really been saved? He actually goes to Georgia, and he says, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but who shall convert me?" And he's struggling with this question of, he's preaching Jesus and what Jesus died on the cross, but he's struggling. Have I really come to faith in Christ? Am I there yet? He returns to England in having these spiritual struggles, and yet it's in the context of doing ministry. And somebody tells him, preach faith until you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. And he hears those words, and he says, okay, I can do that. And he hears one particular sermon, not even sure what the sermon was on, and he says, my heart was strangely warmed. And he seems to have taken that as his conversion experience, converted in the midst of ministry. Subsequently, he is excluded from the Anglican Church because of his preaching, because he's preaching to everyone. It's just not accepted by the church, and he says, that's okay, the whole world is my parish. I will go out and preach to anyone. I will preach outdoors, indoors, wherever I can. And he follows Whitefield then in outdoor preaching, but he embraces Arminianism as opposed to Whitefield's Calvinism. Now, that's not to say that these two were bitter enemies or anything like that. In fact, Whitefield, describing their relationship at a later date, he says, 10,000 times would I rather have died than part with my old friends. It would have melted any heart to have heard Mr. Charles Wesley and me weeping after prayer, that if possible, the breach, because there was a little bit of a theological breach between them, that the breach might be prevented. And then Wesley, speaking of Whitefield, said his fundamental point was, give God all the glory of whatever is good in man. Set Christ as high and man as low as possible in the business of salvation. All merit is in the blood of Christ, and all power in and from the Spirit of Christ. And with that, I think Wesley might have agreed. Notice how he's couching his terms. Now, some factors in the spiritual decline after the First Great Awakening, because we're going to have not only a First Great Awakening, but we're going to have a Second Great Awakening. And if we go from a First Great Awakening to a Second Great Awakening, what happened in the middle? Everybody went back to, spiritually, they went back to sleep. And what are the factors that brought this about? Well, first of all, there was the American War for Independence. And war is not necessarily a time when people are getting more spiritual. If anything, they're getting less spiritual. There were also the deistic teachings of Thomas Paine, who taught, yeah, there's a God somewhere, and he's the one who created everything, but he sort of let the thing into orbit spin, and it's out doing its own thing, and God went his way, and we go ours, and never the twain shall meet. It's been estimated that the percentage of Americans who were church members after the War of Independence was around 15%, which means that 85% of the people had no church affiliation. Now, in our timeline, notice we have the First Great Awakening in the early part of the 1700s. The Second Great Awakening will begin right at the end of the 1700s and go into the middle of the 1800s. One of the figures, the beginning figures for the Second Great Awakening, will be Timothy Dwight. He's the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, also a Calvinist. He's president of Yale College, and under him there is a revival of the students at Yale as students begin to come into contact with the message of the gospel and have their lives transformed by it. One of those students is Lyman Beecher, who himself will be a preacher and a leader in the Second Great Awakening. Asiel Nettleton, another of the preachers during this movement. Nettleton studies at Yale after the revival had begun there, and he's both Reformed and a Calvinist, but he's an evangelist. He's all about sharing the gospel to folks that don't know it. And in doing so, he's rejecting the excesses that are beginning to be commonplace in his day. He says of the revivals in his day, the ones in which he's participating, these revivals were not temporary excitements. Notice he's contrasting that with some of the others that were going on in his day. These revivals were not temporary excitements which like a tornado sweep through a community and leave desolations behind them, but they were like showers of rain which refresh the dry and thirsty earth and cause it to bring forth herbs meet for them by whom it is dressed. And these fruits were permanent. One of the ways you can tell the effectiveness of a revival is, does it need to be redone the following year, or are there lasting changes? Now, that brings up the contrast between the First and Second Great Awakenings. The First Great Awakening, this goes from the 1730s to the 1750s, roughly a 20-year period. Remember, we're painting with a very broad brush. The Second Great Awakening starts in the 1790s and then goes all the way to the 1840s. So it's going to be over a longer period of time. The First Great Awakening focused primarily in the colonies along the eastern seaboard because that's where the people were. The Americas had not spread out further west as of yet. In the Second Great Awakening, this is felt throughout the entire new nation, and by now there is a nation. It's no longer just the colonies. There is an American nation now. In the First Great Awakening, we have figures like George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, not all of them Calvinists, but notice there seems to be something of a preponderance of Calvinists in that. In the Second Great Awakening, we have Charles Finney, Lyman Beecher, Peter Cartwright, and we'll mention a few more of those in just a moment. In the First Great Awakening, like we just said, it was largely, not exclusively, but largely Calvinistic. In the Second Great Awakening, it's largely Arminian. Now, we have in that Second Great Awakening camp meeting revivals where as the people are moving west, so the revival moves westward, and that means you have not an abundance of large cities, and so you're going to have revivals take place in camps that will draw people from all over the place, and they will come together for sometimes a couple of days or even a week for this almost like party atmosphere as they come to hear the preaching of God's Word. You also have, this is the time of the circuit riding preachers, where you begin to have small little country churches planted throughout the nation, and there are not enough preachers to go around. And so one preacher might end up serving in 3 or 4 or 5 or more different churches in a large circuit, and he would go from one to the next, performing weddings or funerals or training up lay people, just bringing the Word of God to people. Now, one figure that's I just like to dwell on for a few minutes, Peter Cartwright, because I think he captures sort of the spirit of the Old West, and yet wanting to bring God into the picture. He's a Methodist preacher, and he's been described with the nickname God's Plowman. Not necessarily somebody who's refined. In fact, he describes in his own writings how he dealt with the rowdies, sometimes by physical confrontation. He said, it was part of my creed to love everyone but to fear no one, and I did not permit myself to believe that any man could whip me till it was tried. And so what would happen if somebody was disturbing the sermon, he might call them out back, and they take off their jackets and they beat the tar out of each other, and then he comes back and finishes his sermon. Charles Finney is another figure from this period. He starts off as a Presbyterian evangelist and a revivalist preacher in New York City. He's also standing against slavery, but we see him quickly moving away from Presbyterian roots and specifically over to Arminian theology. He says in his preaching, "Should the firemen sleep and let the whole city burn down, what would be thought of such a fireman? And yet their guilt would not compare with the guilt of Christians who sleep while sinners around them are sinking stupid into the fires of hell." Rather blunt, but it needed to be said. That was a good thing to say. He said, instead of telling sinners to use the means of grace, and he's speaking actually against the form of Calvinism that he'd heard. Instead of telling sinners to use the means of grace and to pray for a new heart, I call on them to make for themselves a new heart and press the duty of immediate surrender to God. So Finney's all about make a decision. In fact, he had what was called the anxious bench, where in the church they might reserve the front pew for those first-time visitors, and if you could sort of be cajoled up to sit in that anxious bench, he'd try to make you anxious by preaching right at you. You sinner, you need to turn to the Lord, and sort of get in your face about that. Not in itself a bad thing, but notice in his words here, he's calling on themselves to make a new heart, and I would suggest that we're called to come to the gospel, and that he makes a new heart in us. Now, another of the preachers of the Second Great Awakening would be Lyman Beecher. He had attended Yale with Isael Nettleton, and he's a Presbyterian minister, and adopted, however, Finney's new measures, these measures that are sort of contrived to get people to make a decision. He also speaks against slavery. I think that's a good thing. It was an injustice that needed the voice of Christians in this issue. And his daughter, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is going to write a very influential work of fiction entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really traces the story of slavery through two imaginary characters, two Christians. And in the first one, it's so very striking, where this black Christian is being beaten to death by these racial bigot slave owners, and in doing so, he's praying for them, and he's trying to act like Jesus, who's giving his life for them as he prays for them. And it's a very moving story. And it probably did more to excite people toward this anti-slavery cause than all of the arguments that otherwise might have been presented, because it touched to the heart. Now, some of the results of the Second Great Awakening. First of all, there was what we could call a Christianization of America. That is, America began to be, at least in the view of many, a Christian nation. That's not to say that everybody was a Christian, but it impacted society, it impacted culture. There was also the democratization of the American Christianity. That is, people began to look at the church and to view the church in the same way they viewed their nation, and that the church ought to act a certain way because that's how Americans act. And so this is going to have an impact upon the church as well. There was also the decline of Calvinism among American Christians. One of the reasons this was so is because the Calvinistic churches usually tended to say, in order to be a pastor, you need to spend so many years in study and preparation. There was a call for a very learned pastorate, and that would take a long time. And in the meantime, the nation is just growing before your eyes, and churches are springing up, and they need pastors to fill the pulpits of these churches. And if they can't get a studied, Calvinistic pastor who spent years preparing for the ministry, they'll just get any old person. And here's somebody who just trusted Christ last week, but he can speak okay, and he's going to be leading the churches. And more often than not, he hasn't been trained in that area, and so instead, you often have at this date Arminian pastors taking the pulpits of those church denominations which had originally been Calvinist, and after a while they're not anymore.